They were surrounded on three sides. The first Russian assault wave had broken through the outer defensive line and was now pressing from the north. A second element had worked around through a tree line to the east and was engaging from that direction. A third was pushing from the west along a drainage channel that Ukrainian defensive planners had assessed as an unlikely approach route, and Russian assault commanders had assessed as exactly the kind of approach that Ukrainian defenders would leave underwatched. The Ukrainian paratroopers who held the Strongpoint in eastern Ukraine did not retreat. They had no order to retreat. They had an order to hold and a radio link to an artillery coordination element that was already working the fire mission requests, and FPV drones staged at the position that could be launched directly from the Strongpoint against attackers who were now close enough that the pilots could see their targets without optical magnification. They held for 4 hours. Reinforcements broke through to them in the early afternoon of a mid-April day. The Strongpoint was still in Ukrainian hands. The Russian breakthrough that had pushed through the outer line and reached the position had been contained and then reversed, and the Ukrainian paratroopers who had been fighting from three directions simultaneously were still alive. Every one of them. This is the story of those 4 hours. This is what it cost Russia to attempt to take a position that Ukrainian paratroopers had decided they were not giving up. And this is what Ukrainian combined arms coordination looks like when it is executed at the small unit level, under fire, with the outcome depending on the decisions of soldiers who had no option to wait for orders that might not arrive in time. The Russian assault that preceded the breakthrough had been building for several hours before the outer defensive line was penetrated. Ukrainian intelligence had tracked the assembly of assault elements, the infantry groupings, the light armored support, the fire support coordination that typically precedes a serious assault attempt, and had reported the indications to the defensive command element responsible for the sector. The defensive command had repositioned some elements in response, strengthening specific points on the outer line where the assault was assessed as most likely to concentrate. The penetration came at a point that had been assessed as secondary, a gap between two positions on the outer line where terrain features had created a blind spot in the mutual fire coverage that makes a prepared defensive line costly to assault. Russian assault commanders had identified the gap through their own reconnaissance and had directed their assault through it, accepting that the penetration point was not the most direct route to the Ukrainian Strongpoint, but was the route where Ukrainian defensive fire's coverage was least effective. The outer line breach took approximately 40 minutes from the initiation of the assault to the point where Russian elements had passed through in sufficient numbers to reach the approaches to the Strongpoint. Ukrainian forces on the outer line fought to contain the penetration, reducing the number of Russian soldiers who made it through but unable to close the gap entirely before the leading Russian assault element was in contact with the Strongpoint's outer security positions. The Ukrainian paratroopers inside the Strongpoint received the warning of the penetration and immediately began their defensive response. The Strongpoint's design prepared fighting positions with overhead cover, interlocking fields of fire on the approaches, cleared lanes that gave defenders observation, and fire's coverage of the ground between the position and the surrounding terrain had been built specifically for the scenario now unfolding. The engineering investment that Ukrainian soldiers had made in the position over the preceding weeks was now the difference between a position that could sustain a multi-directional assault and a position that would have been overwhelmed quickly by the forces now surrounding it. The FPV drones staged at the position gave the defenders a capability that traditional Strongpoint defense doctrine does not include. Ukrainian paratroopers who had been trained in FPV drone employment launched their first drone against the lead Russian assault element approaching from the north within minutes of the breakthrough alert. The strike hit the front soldier of the assault group, the point man whose movement the rest of the assault element was following, at a range of approximately 150 meters from the Strongpoint perimeter. The assault group halted. The following soldiers went to ground. This is a specific capability that changes the tactical geometry of Strongpoint defense in ways that military doctrine has not yet fully incorporated. A defender with FPV drones can engage attacking soldiers at ranges that make the assault approach costly before those soldiers reach the positions where they can bring their direct fire weapons to bear effectively. The effective range of the assault element's weapons, their rifles, their RPGs, the light machine guns that provide assault fire support, is now the same as the effective range of the defending FPV operator. But the FPV is a one-way weapon. It consumes itself in the engagement, and does not expose the operator to the return fire that a conventional direct-fire engagement would generate. The defending soldier launching FPV drones from a prepared position is engaging the attacking force without accepting the reciprocal risk that conventional close combat creates. Ukrainian paratroopers at the Strongpoint had trained for exactly this defensive employment of FPV drones. They had stocks of drones staged at the position. They had operators, soldiers with FPV piloting training, who could be assigned to the drone role, while other paratroopers managed the direct fire defense of the perimeter. The combination of conventional defensive fires from the prepared positions and FPV engagement of the assault approaches created a defensive fire system that Russian assault commanders had not fully accounted for in their planning. The eastern approach, the Russian element that had worked through the tree line, encountered the FPV engagement on its approach as well. Ukrainian operators managing the eastern sector launched drones along the tree line edge, engaging the soldiers moving from the tree line toward the Strongpoint perimeter. The strikes disrupted the eastern element's ability to maintain the coordinated pressure from that direction that Russian assault doctrine calls for, forcing soldiers to spread out, to slow their approach, to seek cover that the open terrain between the tree line and the Strongpoint did not readily provide. The western approach, along the drainage channel, was the most dangerous of the three because the drainage channel itself provided Russian assault soldiers with a covered approach route that brought them within close range of the Strongpoint perimeter before they were fully exposed. Ukrainian paratroopers on the western perimeter engaged the soldiers moving along the channel with direct fire from positions that had been specifically constructed to cover the channel. A detail of the Strongpoint's defensive design that Ukrainian engineers had incorporated based on their terrain analysis of the approaches. The drainage channel that Russian assault commanders had assessed as an underwatched approach had in fact been specifically accounted for in the defensive planning. The artillery coordination that ran throughout the 4-hour engagement was conducted by a Ukrainian fire support element who maintained radio contact with the Strongpoint throughout the engagement. The fire missions were not directed at the attackers in immediate contact with the Strongpoint. That engagement was being handled by the paratroopers' own weapons and drones. The artillery was directed at the assembly areas and the approach routes beyond the immediate engagement area, disrupting the Russian command's ability to feed reinforcements into the assault, interdicting the routes that replacement assault elements would use to maintain pressure on the position. This separation of fires, direct engagement of assault soldiers by the defending paratroopers, interdiction of the support structure by artillery, reflects a fires coordination principle that Ukrainian defensive doctrine has refined through operational experience. Attempting to use artillery in the immediate close combat engagement risks casualties among defending paratroopers whose positions are already in close proximity to the attacking soldiers. Directing artillery further back, against the elements that are maintaining the assault from a distance, achieves the interdiction effect without that risk, and sustains the Russian command's inability to reinforce or reconstitute the assault elements that the paratroopers' own weapons are already engaging. The 4 hours between the Russian breakthrough and the arrival of Ukrainian reinforcements were not static. Russian assault commanders made multiple attempts to regenerate pressure on the Strongpoint after the initial assault groups were disrupted. They brought additional soldiers forward through the penetration in the outer line. They attempted to establish a fire support position that would allow them to engage Ukrainian defenders in the Strongpoint with heavier weapons than the assault infantry were carrying. Ukrainian drone observation, maintained throughout the engagement by reconnaissance platforms operating from above the close combat area, tracked these attempts and fed targeting data to the artillery coordination element, which engaged the Russian fire support position before it could become effective. The reinforcement that reached the Strongpoint in the early afternoon arrived through a route that Ukrainian command had kept open by directing specific artillery missions against the Russian elements that had been attempting to interdict it. The reinforcing force was not simply responding to the breakthrough. It was moving along a route that Ukrainian fires were actively defending on its behalf, a coordination that required continuous communication between the reinforcing element, the Strongpoint, the artillery coordination element, and the drone operators maintaining observation of the entire engagement area. When the reinforcements arrived, the immediate tactical situation changed. The Russian assault elements that had been maintaining pressure on the Strongpoint from three directions were now facing the same force from their rear as well as from the position they had been attacking. The Russian soldiers who had penetrated the outer line and invested the Strongpoint found themselves in the position their opponents had been in 4 hours earlier, surrounded under fire from multiple directions, without the reinforcement and resupply that sustained close combat requires. The Russian breakthrough was reversed. The penetration was closed. The outer defensive line was restored to Ukrainian control. Now let us examine what Russia paid. The assault on the Strongpoint and the subsequent reversal produced Russian casualties that conservative battlefield analysis estimates at 80 to 120 soldiers killed or seriously wounded across the 4-hour engagement. This figure accounts for the losses in the initial assault waves. The soldiers lost to FPV drone engagement during the siege of the Strongpoint, the casualties produced by Ukrainian artillery fires against the approach routes and assembly areas, and the losses during the reversal, when Russian assault elements were caught between the reinforced Strongpoint and the Ukrainian forces closing the penetration. At current Russian replacement costs for infantry, training, equipment, and logistics investment, this casualty figure represents $1.2 to $3 million in direct personnel costs. The light armored vehicles supporting the assault, 2 of which were destroyed by Ukrainian anti-tank fires during the engagement, add $2 to $4 million in vehicle replacement costs. The operational cost of the failed breakthrough compounds the materiel figure. Russian commanders had invested in the planning, reconnaissance, and assault preparation for this operation, with the expectation of penetrating Ukrainian defenses and creating an exploitable gap. The failure of the operation means that investment is unrecoverable. The assault forces that were committed to this operation must be reconstituted, the casualties replaced, the expended ammunition resupplied, the assault units rested and reorganized before they can be used for another attempt. Ukrainian paratroopers held a surrounded position for 4 hours with drones, rifles, and artillery coordination. They held it against 3 simultaneous assault directions. They held it without retreat and without loss of their entire force. They held it because they had prepared the position, trained for the scenario, and trusted the command system that was supporting them through the artillery coordination and the reinforcement that arrived when it was needed. The Strongpoint in eastern Ukraine is still Ukrainian ground. The paratroopers who held it are still alive, and the Russian breakthrough that penetrated the outer defensive line and reached the position found, in the paratroopers who were waiting there, something it could not overcome. Ukraine holds, even when surrounded, even when outnumbered, even for 4 hours against 3 assault directions simultaneously. Ukraine holds because its soldiers choose to hold, and because the system they operate in gives them the tools and the support to make that choice survivable. The Strongpoint stands. The paratroopers hold. The line is restored. To understand what this engagement represents beyond the tactical narrative, it is necessary to examine what the 4-hour defense of a surrounded Strongpoint demonstrates about Ukrainian military capability at the small unit level, and why that capability is the most durable and most difficult for Russia to defeat. Russian military planning for breakthroughs in eastern Ukraine is based on a model of Ukrainian defensive collapse that has repeatedly failed to materialize. The model assumes that if Russian forces can penetrate the outer defensive line, if they can create confusion and disrupt communications, if they can isolate individual defensive positions from mutual support, then Ukrainian defenders will either withdraw or be overwhelmed before they can be reinforced. The assumption of collapse, once penetration is achieved, has driven Russian operational planning across dozens of assault operations on the Eastern Front. The Ukrainian paratroopers who held the Strongpoint for 4 hours demonstrated in the most direct possible way that this assumption is wrong. Surrounded, under fire from 3 directions, with the outer defensive line breached behind them, every condition that Russian operational planning assumed would produce collapse. They did not collapse. They fought. They coordinated. They used the tools available to them and the training they had received and the preparation they had made to the position, and they held until the system they were part of sent reinforcement to restore the tactical situation. Understanding why they were able to do this requires examining several specific elements of Ukrainian military preparation that are not always visible from the outside, but that were directly responsible for the outcome. The first element is the Strongpoint's physical design. Ukrainian defensive engineering in eastern Ukraine has evolved substantially through the conflict. And the positions that Ukrainian soldiers hold today reflect accumulated lessons about what works and what does not in the specific ground conditions, terrain features, and assault methods of eastern Ukraine. The prepared fighting positions with overhead cover that the paratroopers were defending from were not improvised. They were constructed to specific engineering standards that account for the caliber and type of fires that Russian assault support typically delivers. The interlocking fields of fire were laid out based on the specific approach routes that terrain analysis had identified as most likely, the same terrain analysis that had accounted for the drainage channel approach that Russian assault commanders thought was underwatched. The position had been built to fight exactly the assault it was facing. The second element is the FPV drone employment. Ukrainian paratroopers, who are assigned to defensive positions in eastern Ukraine, are now routinely trained in FPV drone operation as part of their standard skill set. This is a significant shift from earlier in the conflict, when FPV employment was a specialized skill of dedicated drone units. The integration of FPV capability into standard infantry defensive operations, placing drone stocks at strong points, training paratroopers to pilot them in the defensive role, incorporating drone employment into defensive procedures has fundamentally changed the close combat geometry of defending a position. The Ukrainian paratroopers who launched drones from inside the surrounded Strongpoint were not calling for external support. They were applying an organic defensive capability from resources already at the position. That organic capability bought time and created space that allowed the artillery coordination and the reinforcement to develop. The third element is the artillery coordination, the fire support element that maintained radio contact with the surrounded Strongpoint throughout the 4 hours of engagement was not simply a communications relay. It was an active fires management capability that directed artillery against the Russian elements attempting to reinforce and reconstitute the assault, preventing the breakthrough from being exploited and preventing the assault on the Strongpoint from being sustained at the tempo Russian commanders were attempting to maintain. The ability to direct fires from a surrounded position against the forces surrounding you requires communications equipment that works under fire, operators who can manage the radio link under combat stress, and an artillery element on the far end that can process and respond to fire missions at the speed the close combat situation demands. All of these worked as designed. The fourth element is the reinforcement. Reinforcements arriving 4 hours after a breakthrough is detected and a position is surrounded represents a response time that reflects specific Ukrainian command capability. The ability to identify the situation, organize a reinforcing force, plan a route that avoids the Russian penetration elements, and execute the movement under fire with the artillery support needed to keep the route open. This is not a simple coordination task. It requires the kind of practiced command and control procedures that only function correctly when they have been trained, tested, and refined through operational experience. All four elements work together in this engagement. The position held because its engineering was sound. It held because its defenders had organic FPV capability. It held because its fires coordination was effective. It held because the Ukrainian command system responded with reinforcement that arrived before the position was overcome. Russian assault commanders who planned this breakthrough had planned for Ukrainian defensive collapse. They encountered Ukrainian defensive competence. The difference between those two outcomes is not a matter of equipment or numbers. The paratroopers who held the Strongpoint were outnumbered and outgunned by the forces surrounding them in terms of raw numbers. The differences in training, preparation, coordination, and the specific decision of Ukrainian paratroopers to fight from a position they had prepared and to trust the system they were part of to support them. The Russian soldiers who assaulted that position were also doing their jobs with whatever skill and courage they had. They penetrated the outer line. They surrounded the position. They maintained pressure from 3 directions for 4 hours. They were stopped not by an absence of effort, but by the presence of Ukrainian defenders who had prepared more effectively, who had organic capabilities that Russian assault planning had not fully accounted for, and who had the support of a command system that kept artillery coordinated and reinforcement moving toward them throughout the engagement. The breakthrough was reversed. The penetration was closed. The outer line was restored to Ukrainian control, and the paratroopers who had been surrounded for 4 hours were still in their position when the reinforcements arrived. Their defensive capability intact, their strongpoint holding the ground that Russian assault commanders had believed they could take. Ukrainian paratroopers hold because they prepare to hold. They prepare because they understand that the ground they are defending is their country's ground. Invaded, contested, and worth every hour of cold preparation and every minute of combat that holding it requires. Surrounded, outnumbered, fighting for 4 hours. Still there when the reinforcements arrived? Still there when the line was restored? Ukraine holds what it has prepared to hold, and the paratroopers of eastern Ukraine have prepared everything. One final element of this engagement deserves to be named, one that goes beyond tactics and system analysis to the experience of the individual soldiers in the Strongpoint during those 4 hours. Being surrounded is a specific psychological experience that military training attempts to prepare soldiers for, but that no training fully replicates. The awareness that there are hostile forces between you and your own lines, that the retreat route is closed, that the direction you would move if you chose to move is covered by the same forces pressing against your perimeter, creates a quality of pressure that is different from the pressure of a frontal assault, however intense. In a frontal assault, the direction of safety is behind you. In a surrounded position, there is no safe direction. There is only the perimeter and what is on the other side of it. Ukrainian paratroopers who held that strongpoint experienced 4 hours of that pressure. 4 hours of incoming fire from 3 directions. 4 hours of the uncertainty about whether the outer line would be restored before the position was overwhelmed. 4 hours of radio calls, the artillery coordination, the situation reports to command, the communication with the reinforcing force as it worked toward them. As the only connection to a larger force that was, for those hours, physically out of reach. They managed that pressure. They managed it by doing the work that the situation required, launching drones, engaging approaching soldiers, maintaining the perimeter, calling fires, reporting status, sustaining the defensive effort that every hour of those 4 hours required. The focus on the immediate task, what needs to be done in the next 60 seconds, is the psychological tool that soldiers under sustained close combat develop, and it is what the paratroopers in the Strongpoint use to manage 4 hours of a situation that their training had prepared them for. But that is, in its full reality, something that only the experience of it fully teaches. They held, every one of them. And when the reinforcements arrived and the tactical situation began to shift in their favor, they were still in their positions, still functional, still fighting. This is what Ukrainian paratroopers are. This is what they do. Surrounded in eastern Ukraine in the middle of April, holding a position against 3 assault directions, 4 hours, all alive. Ukraine holds. Its paratroopers hold. The Eastern Front holds with them.